All right, let's talk about a law that is famously powerful, often really controversial, and honestly, the key to understanding why almost anything gets built or doesn't get built in the state of California. We're going to dive into the California Environmental Quality Act, but you probably know it as CEQA. When you think of California, you think of the Golden Gate Bridge, the Sierras. The environment here isn't just pretty scenery, it's a huge part of the state's identity. But that very same environment is at the center of this constant tug of war over development, which makes the simple act of building anything here incredibly complicated. So, have you ever looked at a vacant lot and wondered why it's been empty for like a decade? Or heard about some big project getting tangled up in what seems like endless delays? Well, you've seen this complexity firsthand, and a huge piece of that puzzle often comes down to one simple four-letter acronym: CEQA. Okay, so here's our game plan. First up, we'll get to the heart of what CEQA actually is. Then we'll walk through what happens when the review process kicks off. We're going to take a peek inside the big, scary environmental impact report, look at some really interesting real-world conflicts, and finally, see how a decision actually gets made in the end. So, what is this thing, really? Well, probably the easiest way to think about it is as the official rulebook. It's the guide that everyone, from a huge developer to your local city hall, has to follow before a single shovel can even touch the ground. What that really means is CEQA basically hits the pause button. Before any public agency can give a project the go-ahead, it has to stop, look, and listen. The law requires them to publicly identify all the potential impacts. And we're talking about everything from traffic and air quality to historical sites and even wildlife. And this quote, man, it really gets to the heart of it. This isn't just about what the government has to do. The law itself says that protecting the environment is a shared duty for every single citizen. And CEQA, it's the main legal tool designed to make that shared responsibility a real thing. Okay, so how does this whole thing actually play out in the real world? Let's imagine we have a project, and we're going to follow it as it starts its journey and faces its very first hurdles. So it all kicks off with three big screening questions. First, is this thing even a project under the law? For CEQA to apply, a public agency has to use its own judgment to approve it. It can't just be a rubber stamp. Second, is it exempt? The law has some common sense exceptions, for things like emergency repairs. And if it clears those two, we move to step 3, the initial study. Think of it as a first look, a quick check to see if there's any chance the project could have a major effect on the environment. And this isn't just some abstract rule, right? It has real-world consequences. Take this case in Santa Cruz County. Residents challenged the permits for 10 little cell antennae, but the county argued, and the court actually agreed, that they fit the small structures exemption. Because they were small and didn't really stand out, they got to completely bypass the whole CEQA process. Okay, so that initial study, it leads to this massive fork in the road. If the study finds zero evidence of any significant impact, the agency just issues what's called a negative declaration. And bam, the CEQA process is over for that project. But if that study finds that a project may have a significant impact, well, that's what triggers the big one, the Environmental Impact Report, or EIR. And that EIR, oh boy. This is where things get really intense. It is by far the most demanding, time-consuming, and often the most fought-over part of this whole process. For any major project, it's a true gauntlet. So what exactly goes into one of these massive documents? Well, it has to cover 4 main things. First, it has to spell out every single potential significant impact. Second, it must propose specific mitigation measures, which is just a fancy way of saying, here's exactly what we're going to do to reduce those impacts. Third, it has to look at alternatives, and that includes the very important what if we do nothing option. And finally, it has to look at cumulative impacts. Basically, how does this project's damage stack up with all the other stuff going on in the area? And the whole point of all this detail is transparency. As one court put it, an EIR has to be written so clearly that anyone, even somebody who knows nothing about the project, can pick it up and really truly understand what's at stake. See, at its core, CEQA isn't designed to just stop things. It's designed to force information out into the open for everyone to see. I know, this can all sound a little dry and procedural, but trust me, this is where the debates over development really catch fire. So, let's look at a couple of real-world cases where this law came roaring to life. Okay, first up, you've got to hear this one, the truly bizarre case of the historic cottage.
So in San Diego, a developer gets a permit and demolishes a cottage. After the city told him it wasn't historic. No problem. Then, after it's already a pile of rubble, he applies to build a new house. But then, and you can't make this stuff up, the city council does a complete 180, declares the demolished cottage a historical resource, and forces him into a full CEQA review for the new project based on the destruction of the old one. It's just a wild example of how tricky it can be to even define what the environment is.
All right, next up, traffic. We all love traffic, right? Well, in Fremont's historic Niles district, a new project was on the table. The study showed it would make traffic at a key intersection go from really bad to an absolute nightmare, from what's called a level of service E to an F, which is basically total gridlock. But here was the twist. According to the city's own official rules for the whole city, that jump wasn't technically a significant impact. But the court saw it differently. It sided with the local residents. They argued that Niles was a special case. As they put it, the town was geographically cut off, and gridlock there would completely destroy the character of their historic district. The court's ruling was a big deal. It said you can't just use a one-size-fits-all rulebook. CEQA forces you to look at the unique local context. And in this case, that potential harm was more than enough to require a full, deep-dive EIR.
Okay, so after all the studies, the public hearings, the endless reports, how does this thing actually end? How does a final decision get made? Let's look at the end game.
You know, a lot of people think that if a project has major environmental impacts, it's just done. But that's not actually true. There are two main ways a project can still get approved. The most common is to approve with mitigation. That means the project moves forward, but only with specific, required changes to lessen the harm. But the second path is to approve with overriding considerations, and this one is really interesting. So this statement of overriding considerations is a really big deal. It's basically a formal document where the government has to say in writing, yep, we know this project is going to cause environmental damage that we can't fix. However, we've decided that its economic or social or other benefits are so important that they outweigh that damage. It's the legal escape hatch that lets projects with significant unavoidable impacts still move forward. And that right there, that's probably the single most important thing to understand about CEQA. It's not a big red no button. It's a pause and think button. The law does not force a specific outcome. Its entire job is to force a detailed, public, evidence-based conversation about the trade-offs we're making. It forces everyone to stop and ask, is there a better way to build this? Which, of course, leaves us with the million-dollar question at the very core of CEQA, doesn't it? The law gives us the process for weighing a project's benefits against its environmental costs, but it very deliberately does not give us the answer. It leaves that difficult decision up to us, as citizens, working through our public agencies, to decide what kind of future we're willing to build and what price we're really willing to pay for it.